The commander told her to leave the briefing room without even looking at her name tag. And for a moment it seemed like just another routine dismissal of a young civilian who didn't belong, until a quiet voice from the back of the room said the one sentence that would freeze every officer in place. "Sir, she's the reason you're alive." The operations center at Falcon Ridge Forward Base was rarely quiet, but on that morning the tension in the air was thick enough to feel. Screens glowed along the walls displaying satellite feeds and tactical overlays, while the large digital map at the center table showed a web of routes, patrol zones, and enemy positions. Around the table stood a tight cluster of officers and senior NCOs, pilots, intelligence analysts, recon leaders, all focused on the man speaking at the front of the room. Commander Daniel Ross had the kind of voice that filled a room without effort. Years of command had carved authority into his posture, and his words carried the steady confidence of someone used to making decisions that determined who came home and who didn't. "The patrol will move through Sector 9 here," he said, tapping a stylus against the glowing terrain map. "Recon Team Echo inserts before dawn, establishes observation on the ridge line, and we maintain overwatch until the convoy clears the valley." A few officers nodded while others scribbled notes, the quiet scratch of pens blending with the low hum of equipment. The door at the back of the briefing room opened softly, almost unnoticed. A young woman stepped inside. She paused just inside the doorway as if giving the room time to notice her presence, though no one immediately did. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray jacket, boots dusted lightly with road grit. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she carried a small notebook in one hand. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that would draw attention in a crowded hallway, but there was a certain stillness in the way she moved, a calm awareness in the way her eyes briefly scanned the room before she took a seat quietly along the back wall. She looked young, late 20s at most. From a distance, she could have passed for a contractor, an analyst, maybe even someone who had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. For a few moments the briefing continued uninterrupted. Ross walked through the mission timeline, his stylus tracing routes across the map, while the officers around the table leaned forward, following every detail. "If the surveillance drone confirms movement in this grid," he continued, "we adjust the convoy route," and he stopped mid-sentence. Something had caught his eye. Ross had spent too many years in command to miss changes in a room. His gaze drifted toward the back wall, where the young woman sat quietly with her notebook resting on her knee. For a moment he simply stared at her, trying to place the unfamiliar face among his staff. He didn't recognize her. His brow tightened slightly. The room noticed the pause almost immediately. Conversations died mid-whisper. Ross lowered the stylus slowly and straightened his posture. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. Every head in the room turned toward the back. The woman looked up from her notebook. Her expression remained neutral. Ross gestured toward her with a small movement of his hand. "This is a classified operational briefing." The words hung in the air. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. The woman held Ross's gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I understand." Her voice was quiet but steady. Ross folded his arms. "Then you also understand that civilians are not authorized to sit in on mission briefings." A few officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Ross pointed toward the door. "You'll need to step outside." The woman closed her notebook slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply rose from her chair with an almost practiced calm. "Of course," she said. For a moment, it looked like the interruption would end there. She took one step toward the door, then another. Ross had already turned back toward the map, ready to resume the briefing, when a hesitant voice broke the silence. "Sir, wait." Ross stopped again. Irritation flickered across his face as he turned toward the speaker. It was one of the intelligence analysts seated near the main console, a young lieutenant named Carter who had been monitoring the mission database throughout the briefing. Carter was staring at the computer screen in front of him with an expression that had suddenly gone pale. Ross frowned. "What is it, Lieutenant?" Carter hesitated, his fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether he should speak. "Sir, I think," his voice trailed off. Ross's patience was thinning. "You think what?" Carter looked from the screen to the woman, now standing near the door. His eyes widened slightly. "Sir, I think she's actually part of the briefing. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Ross turned slowly toward the woman again. You are? He asked, skeptical. She didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him with the same calm expression she'd worn since entering the room. A recon officer near the table leaned toward Carter's monitor, squinting at the personnel file displayed there. His reaction was immediate. Wait a second, he muttered. Another officer stepped closer. The screen showed a name and a service record that stretched down the page farther than anyone expected. The recon officer looked up slowly. Sir. Ross's gaze hardened. If someone wants to explain why an unidentified civilian just walked into my classified briefing, now would be the time. No one moved. The recon officer swallowed. His voice dropped slightly. Commander, that's Lieutenant Maya Alvarez. The name meant nothing to Ross. He looked back at the woman. She had stopped walking and now stood quietly near the door, watching the room with patient eyes. Ross crossed his arms again. I'm not familiar with that name, he said flatly. A chair scraped lightly across the floor. Another officer stood, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, one of Ross's recon leaders. Hale looked between Ross and the woman with a strange mix of disbelief and concern. Sir, he said carefully, you might not recognize the name. Ross's patience snapped. Then enlighten me, Lieutenant. Hale glanced toward the woman as if asking permission. She gave the smallest nod. Hale took a breath. Sir, Lieutenant Alvarez was the combat medic assigned to Recon Team 7 2 years ago. Ross frowned. And Hale's expression tightened. Sir, Recon Team 7 was your unit. The room fell completely silent. Ross stared at him. That mission was classified. Hale nodded slowly. Yes, sir. He gestured toward the woman standing quietly near the door. But there's one part of that mission you never saw. Ross felt a strange tension settle in his chest. Hale's voice lowered. Because you were unconscious. Several officers looked between them, confusion spreading across their faces. Ross's eyes narrowed slightly as fragments of an old memory stirred somewhere in the back of his mind. Smoke, shouting, the echo of gunfire. Hale continued quietly. Sir, that day you hit an ambush. And across the room, the young woman who had almost been dismissed as an unwanted civilian simply stood there, waiting patiently as the room slowly began to realize that the quiet stranger the commander had just ordered out might not only belong in the briefing. She might be the only person there who had already survived the mission they were about to plan. Lieutenant Marcus Hale's words settled over the room like a sudden change in pressure, and for several long seconds no one spoke. Commander Daniel Ross stood at the head of the briefing table, staring at him. Explain, Ross said, his voice calmer now, but far more serious. Hale stepped forward, glancing briefly toward the young woman near the door before looking back at his commander. Sir, 2 years ago Recon Team 7 was escorting a supply convoy through Arden Valley. Intelligence had cleared the route, but halfway through the canyon, we drove straight into an ambush. Ross felt a faint stir of memory, the flash of an explosion, the sound of metal tearing, but the images were distant and broken. Hale continued. The first IED hit the lead vehicle. The second one hit your Humvee. A few officers around the table leaned closer. The blast flipped the vehicle and threw you onto the road. When we reached you, shrapnel had gone through your vest and your lung had collapsed. Ross frowned slightly, trying to pull the memory into focus. The ambush didn't stop there, Hale said. Enemy machine guns were firing from both ridges. Anyone who tried to move into the open got pinned down. He paused and gestured toward the woman standing quietly near the door. That's when Lieutenant Alvarez ran. Several officers blinked in disbelief. Ran where? Ross asked. Hale pointed across the map projected on the wall. Across the road. 40 meters of open ground with no cover. A murmur passed through the room. Hale nodded. Exactly. She grabbed the field medical pack and sprinted straight through the gunfire to reach you. Ross's gaze slowly shifted toward Maya Alvarez. She stood with her arms relaxed at her sides, listening as if the story had nothing to do with her. Hale continued. When she got to you, you were unconscious and bleeding out. The medevac couldn't land because the landing zone was under fire. Carter, the intelligence officer, leaned forward. So what did she do? Hale gave a quiet breath of disbelief. She turned the overturned Humvee into an operating table. The room went completely silent. She cut open your vest, pulled the shrapnel fragment out, and used a field decompression kit to reinflate your lung," Hale said, all while rounds were hitting the vehicle around her. Ross's eyes widened slightly. "Under fire?" "Constant fire," Hale confirmed. "At one point the enemy started pushing down from the ridge, and we had to split our attention between holding them off and protecting the convoy." He glanced back at Maya. "But she never left your side." Hale's voice grew quieter. "She kept you alive for 40 minutes until the medevac finally landed." Ross slowly uncrossed his arms. "And I don't remember any of it." Hale shook his head. "No, sir. By the time they got you on the helicopter, you were unconscious again." Another officer spoke up softly. "What happened to her?" Hale hesitated before answering. "She got hit." Several people stiffened. Ross looked sharply at Maya. "Hit?" Hale nodded. "Round from the ridge caught her in the shoulder while she was stabilizing you." The room fell silent again. Maya shrugged lightly, as if the detail were unimportant. "It missed anything major," she said. Hale exhaled slowly. "Sir, the doctors later said if she hadn't treated you when she did." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ross looked down at the table for a moment, the weight of the story settling in. Then he lifted his gaze toward the woman he had just ordered out of the room minutes earlier. She met his eyes calmly, without accusation or pride. And in that moment, the commander finally understood that the quiet woman he had nearly dismissed as a civilian observer wasn't just part of the mission briefing. She was the reason he had lived long enough to stand in that room at all. For several seconds, Commander Daniel Ross didn't speak. The operations room that had been filled with confident planning only minutes earlier now felt strangely quiet. Officers who had been leaning over maps and screens were now watching one person, the young woman still standing near the door with her notebook in her hand. Ross slowly walked around the table toward her, each step measured, his expression no longer hard with command but thoughtful, almost unsettled. When he stopped a few feet away, he studied her face as if trying to recognize someone he should have known all along. "You're Lieutenant Maya Alvarez," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Formerly." That single word caught several people off guard. Ross frowned slightly. "Formerly." She shifted her weight a little. "Medical discharge last year," Hale added from behind him. "Complications from the shoulder wound, sir." Ross glanced briefly toward Hale, then back at her. For a moment the room held its breath. The commander who had ordered countless soldiers into danger, the man whose authority filled the entire base, suddenly seemed unsure what to say. Finally he spoke again. "You saved my life." Maya shrugged lightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I did my job." Ross let out a slow breath. Around them, officers were still standing, watching the exchange with quiet respect. The weight of the realization was settling across the room. The woman who had almost been dismissed as an outsider was the very reason their commander was alive. Ross straightened slightly, the soldier in him taking over. Then, in a gesture no one had expected, he came to attention and raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Lieutenant Maya Alvarez," he said with genuine respect. "It's an honor to have you here." The room reacted almost instantly. Chairs shifted as officers stood. A few returned the salute out of instinct, while others simply watched with admiration. Maya looked slightly embarrassed by the sudden attention. She rubbed the back of her neck and gave a small, awkward smile. "You guys don't have to do that," she muttered. The tension in the room softened with a few quiet chuckles. Ross lowered his hand, but his expression remained serious. "Actually," he said, glancing back at the map glowing on the wall, "I think we do." He stepped aside slightly, giving her a clear view of the mission layout. "We're planning to send a recon team through the canyon tomorrow morning." Maya walked closer to the screen, studying the route for a moment. Her expression shifted from awkwardness to quiet focus. After a few seconds, she pointed to a narrow section of the valley. "Right here," she said. Ross followed her finger. "That's the fastest route." Maya nodded slowly. "It's also the exact place we got ambushed last time." Several officers exchanged looks. Ross stared at the map, then back at her. For the first time in the entire briefing, the commander who had been giving orders all morning simply said, "Then we'd better listen." And this time, no one in the room questioned whether she belonged there.